Okay, so I'm just really doing a recap of our conflict of interest policy. We do this every year, and I must admit I managed to steal some of the slides from Marianne's presentations in the previous years. But I think it's really important because it's something that we are continually facing, and I think we're seeing an increase of conflict of interest, not only here in Brisbane, but in the regions. Yes. The regions are quite difficult to manage. So it's pretty straightforward. Where there are two current clients, we can't do it. It just can't happen. Lawyers in LAQ are considered to be one firm, no matter what office they're in. So we can't have a file here in Brisbane and then have a file in Mackay. It won't work. We're one office. We can't have two current clients. So when we're doing our conflict checks, if a party has got representation in a family law matter, we need to refer out. It also relates to any active file, so it's not just family law, it's criminal, civil, anything, and ICL and SEP reps. Advice and minor assistance, that's where we start to find it a bit tricky. Obviously, when we're at court, we're doing a duty lawyer service, that's conflict checked, but our advice clinics aren't. Now, because LAQ gives legal advice and assistance to so many people, we've decided that advice falls below the threshold for our conflict of interest policy. So our current policy says that lawyers are able to give legal advice to people, provided that that lawyer giving the legal advice does not know the details of the advice or representation given to another person in the dispute, and the advice was given by a different LAQ office or team. So we've locked down LAQ office, so lawyers can't see the advice that's been given. So provided that the advice that's proposed is given by a different team and different lawyer, that's okay. If it's by the same team, for instance, if VPWA are giving legal advice to one party and then the other party presents, you can't just get another lawyer from VPWA to give the advice. It needs to be a completely different team. It's important to just remember that fact don't conflict check before giving advice. And advice clinics in the regions are a little bit more complex. And as it currently stands, whilst the policy is that we don't conflict check legal advice, the regions are dealt with individually, and it is at the direction of the regional manager or the principal lawyer within your office. So just bear that in mind. And I think that's because sometimes there might only be one family lawyer in the region, and it just might save the drama of having to conflict out halfway through the advice when you've gone, oh, that sounds so familiar. Yeah. Duty lawyer has a higher chance of bringing us into conflict. We've been giving our LSOs a great deal of training around conflict checking, but it's still very important that we look over forms, duty lawyer forms, because sometimes it might say, oh, there's an ICL, oh, that might be Marianne Huth, and it's not come up in the conflict check and it's made its way to the board at duty lawyer, and you're going, oh, I'm going to go give this advice, and then, oops, hang on, sorry, in-house ICL, we can't do that. So it's just really important to check those forms because these conflicts are slipping through. It's very possible that a lawyer may give advice to someone who is another party in a matter where LAQ represents a party. So it's just really important to just double check these things. And if you do have concern that there is a conflict, just make sure you check with the LSO so that they can do another conflict check.
I think what we identified in Mackay is that the LSOs don't actually know the names of some of the in-house ICLs. So if it comes up and says such and such is the ICL, they don't know. We know who they are because we know the lawyers, but the LSOs don't. So yeah, we've talked to Francis about putting it in, and that it's in-house.
Yeah, and that's certainly something I'm working with at the moment, and it's something that I'll be talking to and assisting the LSOs with at the LSO conference. It is a bit of a process when we're doing conflict checking, which as lawyers we probably don't know because we don't do it. But there is a number of different screens that we have to go through in LA office, and one of those screens is the client comments. And in the client comments, it does have whether or not there's an in-house lawyer. It's not consistent approach by grants because that's data that is entered in by grants, and sometimes it might not say in-house, and so then you follow this this trail of different information to get to whether or not it's an in-house file or not. So it is something that we're working through, and hopefully we'll provide some education to the LSOs at their conference later next month. What should we do when we have a conflict? Give me a call. Or check our email, send an email through to our inbox if it's not an urgent matter. But I am generally available by phone, and I don't even know if that's my right number. I think I typed it incorrectly, so I'll send that out again. But if you do identify a conflict, don't just manage it yourself. It's really important that you do let me know, because I need to document it, and there needs to be some information behind it and on how we manage it in the event that a complaint is ever made. So make sure you do inform me, and then I can just make sure that we put the right processes in place. Generally, if a conflict's identified, we have to refer both files out. Sometimes there might be a vulnerable client that we do want to retain in-house, and there are ways to manage that. But generally speaking, it might be too high of a risk, and we might just have to refer it out. Of course, we can manage it by using our wonderful information barriers, which I'll talk about in just a second. We've also got the issue of, obviously, the former client conflict. Now, we can keep a file in-house when it's an ICL or separate file if there is a former client conflict, provided that it can be established that there's this information barrier that's in place. And so obviously you're all familiar, or most of you are familiar with the undertakings of file managers and screen persons, and that's a part of how we manage our conflict process. Again, this is assessed on a case-by-case basis.
Is the former file the ICL separate, or is the current file ICL separate?
Current file ICL separate, and then their former client would be a party that we've provided advice to.
Well, we had them when Victoria came from private practice. We had to refer out all the ones where Victoria personally acted, but where it was her former firm, we screened them.
And that also comes into play when we have either staff movement. So obviously we might have conflict managed files that are ongoing, and then a staff member moves to a different team, and then that puts the file into a conflict situation. It might need to be locked down. So there are multi-levels of how we manage the conflicts within Legal Aid Queensland. Any files that have been identified as a conflict need to be managed. And so at the moment it's just Kathy and I. I don't know if you've met Kathy, but you've probably all spoken to her on the phone. And we sit upstairs in the family coordination team. Where a conflict's identified, we'll identify who needs to be screened and who needs to sign undertakings, and who there might not need to be undertakings if there's a certain reason. And the screen person will receive the undertaking by email, not to discuss the matter with the file manager. It's really important. I know most of you just tick and flick those emails, but it's really important that you do read them, because they do have information in them that you need to make sure you comply with. The physical file is then marked with the name of the screen person, and it needs to be stored in a secure location. Information's put on visual files so it's clearly identified. This process might be changing slightly in the future, and I will provide updates about that, but I'm trying to make it more user-friendly. And because of the information barriers that exist, only conflict managed files within the same team will be locked down. So usually your whole team will have access to the conflict file unless there's an actual conflict within the same team, and that's when there's restricted access. There are information barriers.
Yeah, can I ask a question on that? With those emails that are sent around, there's no information as to who we've seen on our end, which has caused the conflict. So if we're in duty lawyer, for example, and we've ticked that box, and we don't know what's going on in the other team and the other file, if that person comes back to duty lawyer, we may continue giving advice.
Yeah.
And
that should have been changed probably at least 6 months ago. I have updated those emails to include the person that you provided advice to, so that you know not to give future advice to them. So you should be receiving that. If you're not, can you let me know, because I'll make sure that's definitely updated. Yeah, I'll go back and have a review of those ones, because it should be.
Thanks. The one that you sent me this week or last week, whatever it was, it did have the names.
Yeah.
Because I've had a few, so.
Yeah.
All
yeah.
one name.
I sort of implemented that change about 6 months ago, so it should be happening.
And the other thing is, with the duty lawyer, when we give advice, if the other party has come into fact, given they don't do a conflict check, does that conflict us out from giving duty lawyer advice?
No.
Okay, so as long as if they come into fact just for advice or minor assistance,
So do minor
it's fine?
Yeah.
Minor assistance does conflict us out?
Yeah.
Okay.
So it depends on the level of work. If it's just advice and advice only, then that falls within, as long as it's not done by the same team or the same lawyer, then it's okay. But if we do anything more than that, that's when it becomes problematic.
And the LSO's checking will know whether it was advice or minor assistance?
Yeah, it is clearly identified on there. And that is another reason, is I just want to make sure that at the LSO conference that everybody is aware of the process, because I'm going to take everyone step by step on what different scenarios can happen and what information to look for, just to assist that everyone's knowledge on that. But in terms of information barriers, we've got information barriers between each of the different teams. So every single office is a barrier. And in Brisbane, we've got Family Law 1 and 2 as a team bucket, VPWA 1 and 2 as a team bucket, Children and Young People, the ICL and Child Protection team as a bucket, and then the Family Law Coordination team. So it is just important to remember that if you are moving amongst teams, that your access will change dependent upon the team that you're currently in. There is a lot of confusion around confidential files and confidential clients. These are two different terms. A confidential file is something that's managed by the conflict compliance team, and that's usually because there is someone within your team that is considered a screened person. So we manage access permissions on visual files to allow only those who need access to have to access the file. A confidential client is actually something that's managed by grants, and that might be a personal conflict or something along the lines of within grants or perhaps outside of grants, and that's not something that we can actually assist with. There is a process on the internal intranet which sets out who you can contact depending upon access permissions that you need. So if you do have a confidential client, and your LSOs will know because it says it at the top of your LA office, then it's not something that our team can assist with. Just a reminder, those undertakings that you sign, if there are any changes to your file, you need to let us know. So when I'm talking changes, I'm talking about if a party's name changes, that's really important information that we need to record in our conflict management. If the child's name changes, that also needs to be recorded. And if the file actually changes over to a different file manager, we really need to know, because we need to update our records and send out new undertakings. It'd be really helpful if you can let us know when your files are closed, because otherwise we have a whole bunch of open active files that I'm managing, and there's no other way other than for me to individually go into each individual file to check if they're open.
If we've got a file that there was a conflict on, and then for some reason that file gets split into two, do we need to let you know about that second file?
If a new queue number is given,
Yeah.
then yes, I do need to know. So then, great. Because what will happen is, practically speaking, you'll get some new undertakings for that file, and it'll also be managed as well. If you're a screen person, oops, typo, ensure that you don't speak to the file manager, and ensure you no longer, and ensure that you don't provide advice or minor assistance to the person who's listed in that undertaking. So I will double check that that is going out, but I'm certain that it is. So just make sure that you take a note of that. Just also remember that a conflict can arise at any time. Particularly in family law, we have lots of new players, new partners, new children. There's a whole range of things that can happen. So can we just make sure that, and be mindful that if a new person comes into the matter, that we also conduct a conflict check on them, and make sure that we're making sure there's no conflict. And if you're not sure, give me a call. If I'm not available, also talk to your principal lawyer, because it's better to address the issue then, rather than waiting and having it turn into something bigger than Ben-Hur. So that's it from me. Does anyone have any questions? Yes, Joe.
Look, and like we do have problems in the region, so can I just run some scenarios past you?
Sure.
So, let's assume we want to set rep for an ICL file, but the office has given criminal law advice by a lawyer 4 years ago who no longer works in the office. Is that a conflict?
I would say that. It's fine to see that person.
If it's a legal advice within the family law team by a lawyer that no longer works at the office,
You're good.
we're good. If it's a legal advice given by, let's assume, Mackay, by a current employee,
Yeah.
are we good?
You're good.
We're good. If it's child protection duty lawyer, and it's one of our current staff that is given child protection duty lawyer, and we want an ICL, the ICL family file. We don't know. We might not know that until the conflict check is done by grants. Is that a conflict?
Yes.
So it's when we get to that point that it kicks in.
Yeah.
If
If it was a child protection duty lawyer and it was an advice only and it was done in Mackay, you're good.
Okay.
If it was the flying squad, you're good.
With exception.
But
But in
generally,
Mackay, it is the flying squad.
yeah,
Yeah.
because you're in the same bucket, right? You can access each other's
Well,
information.
we can't.
No,
We
for
actually can't.
advice.
We can't access anything.
We can't access any of
I
Yeah,
can't look up
you-
I
you're-
can't even look up my own advices that I give.
Yeah,
online.
advices you can't get.
But the difficulty is that one of the parties is going to turn up and go, oh yeah, I saw that person. I saw
Possibly,
your
Yeah.
yes.
So I think there's a
Yeah.
level of the perception of
I think the
conflict with.
perception's different to the actual, like, we're trying
Yeah.
to work out.
And
as
if
well.
you're in an I mean, the judgment is, if you're going to be in an ICL file, it's going to be long, it's probably going to be expensive. We don't want to get, 3 weeks out of the trial and go, oh, you've got a conflict, and then we have to send the whole shebang out. So just a bit more careful about that.
And I should say that each file is managed differently. If there are files that we do want to try and keep in-house, we will look at that and see if we can manage it and take that risk. And that's a decision that's made with the assistance of Nikki. So it can be done, but it's something that we want to try and manage.
So I just want to make sure that it's that legal advice component, where, we've had a huge staff turnover, and that staff member no longer works at the office.
Yeah.
that's not creating a raft of conflicts for us.
No, that's fine.
And I mean, in Southport, they have an advice lawyer down there that mostly does family law advice, but they're separated out.
They're
of the
separated
advice law.
out, yeah, you see, whereas
So
we're
that's
all,
not a conflict for them
Yeah.
because they're completely
So it wouldn't matter in those scenarios if the person's left or not, just that it's the advice only. It's fine.
so long as they're in a separate bucket.
so we should just do Mackay's advices and Mackay
Yeah.
should just do our advices.
Yeah.
Just do
Easy
because
solution.
Because I mean, I think that's the reality of what's happening with ICL and separate files is that, as Townsville, we're doing Cairns and Mackay and Cairns are doing Townsville, so I think that's the reality
And
of how we're
what's
managing
happening.
it.
Poor old Bundy almost never gets a Harvey Bay or a Bundy ICL file
Yeah.
because they're just conflicted
Conflicted.
out. Yeah, so they do a lot of Brisbane.
And I think with particularly like Townsville, a lot of your conflicts do arise from the duty lawyer service. So that is something that's really not able to be managed because it's done by your staff, family lawyers in the office. So it's something that we can't go, hey, oh, well, you can have the ICL file because it's just far too big a risk.
Whereas we can hardly see anyone at family law, duty lawyer because of all the conflict.
Yeah.
TV.
Yeah.
I just want to say in relation to the flying squad, a lot of the advices that they do, they're taking legal aid applications.
That's right.
So if it's within 2 weeks of an advice, there might be an application making its way through grants for an in-house lawyer. So it's something to just be aware of before you start seeing someone because it looks like just an advice.
Sorry, say that again.
The flying squad lawyers
Yeah.
are taking legal aid applications for
Okay.
people who they see for advice.
Yes.
So even though it might look on the system like it's just been an advice, there might
Okay.
be an in-house application form making its way through grants. So if it's
Will
within,
we know
say, a
that
2 week
from the client
period,
comment screen?
Should be in the client comment.
It's-
Should be in the client
It's
comment.
not always.
Yeah.
It's not always, but it should be. And we are working. I'm talking with Kylie about ways to get that
Okay.
to show up.
just something to be conscious of.
Yeah.
If it's in a short time frame, that's likely to be.
So,
But I'm saying if
if in doubt, check comments. Like you can't, but your LSO
Yeah.
should.
And I will be
Really
talking to the
properly.
LSOs about that as well, just things to keep out for when they're looking for things.
Alicia, this might be something that's just, well, is something that might be just applicable for grads, but because we do both client and family, I guess my fear is that I will see someone as DV duty lawyer and assist them in getting a protection order, but then I might also see someone as crime duty lawyer, basically where they've breached the order that I've
Yeah.
essentially put them down as a respondent.
Yeah.
And because we don't,
Conflict check with crime.
yeah.
Yeah.
That's,
That is-
Yeah,
I
it's a
think-
risk.
It is a risk, and I think you're going to need to use your own judgment for that. And just, if you recall a certain facts or the person, then you're going to have to go at that point. I'm sorry, I'm conflicted out. I can't provide assistance, and pull a pin on that duty lawyer service. But unfortunately, there's really no other mechanism around it because crime don't really, they don't conflict check. Yeah.
They're a great deal of, they cause a great deal of conflict for families.
My anxiety levels are high when crime's conflict checking processes.
Well, they just don't. They
They
don't.
don't.
Yeah.
And in
And they
terms
don't-
of
yeah. And in
record-
terms of recording crime duty lawyer, there is none.
There, no,
We
yes.
don't know who
No.
crime duty lawyer has seen.
And that's what is hard because I used to be a crime/family lawyer in a region.
Yeah.
It was just
You
becoming
caused-
bigger
you
than
caused
better.
her enormous headaches.
yeah. So I'm actually kind of happy that I just do family now. I wasn't as good at crime anyway, but like it blew my mind that the differences between the two worlds, yet they overlap so much, was crazy.
And whilst there's an actual information barrier present between family and crime on visual files, if you practice in both areas, you will have access to both areas. So I think you just need to be conscious of what you're doing and who you're assisting, and try your best to avoid any conflict situations. Joe, keep your hand up.
Just in that context of the criminal law files.
Yeah.
If there's a criminal law matter by the other party, or a party, the file is closed, archived, and the lawyer no longer works in the office. This actually came up in the last fortnight for us. So the file was 8 years old, hadn't been destroyed yet, but was in archive off-site. And there was a robust discussion as to whether there was a conflict or not. Your thoughts?
What does the crime matter relate to?
Fraud. I can't tell you any more than that because I think that was the only entry, and I mean we didn't go digging any further. So I think the only information we could find was that it related to a fraud.
And were we putting an application through as party or for ICL?
Party, the other party wanted some minor, one of the as client actually. So we were just going to do some advice and minor assistance and potentially take a look at that application.
Yeah. Look, at first blush, I would say it is a conflict, and depending on the vulnerability of the client, I'd probably have to go digging, and that's where a phone call to me would help because then I can have a quick search, go digging and follow the rabbit warren down to see whether or not we can provide any assistance. But the reason I say, obviously it's a conflict at first blush, because you've got a previous file in-house and we may have access to confidential information. But in saying that, we might not have done any work on the file. Could have just been a file that was opened, and
even though, like, you know, some of those, I mean, technically it should have been destroyed already. It just hadn't been destroyed.
And the lawyers left.
Oh yeah, the lawyers were well and truly gone.
Yeah.
It's like
yeah.
Good quality relationship.
I think that's the best option because there's not an easy answer all the time. So it might mean that I need to go have a look and find some information out about the particular file or advice, and that's what I'm there for.
Alicia, when you're the screen person, when the file is closed, do I get an email saying, yeah, you don't need to worry about that undertaking anymore?
Good question.
Because that'd be really handy.
Yeah.
Because I made sure I saved them all and whatnot, and I'm always a bit worried. But then I was like, hang on, probably a dozen of those files are now gone.
I know that when we no longer conflict manage files, I send an email around for that, but we actually don't get notified all that often about closed files, which is why I'm banging on a bit about it today. So I think that should be the appropriate action, so I'll make sure that is done if it's not already done.
Mostly we're taking a long time to close files because we're waiting for grants.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the only other issue, which I think you're probably already aware of, is we get an in-house capacity from grants on a child protection matter, and we say yes, and then it's a conflict because either Dad is represented by a Rocky office and I had a file for Mum, or there was another example of a matter where I had the file for Mum for an extensive period of time, and then another legal aid office was given Dad's file. So are these matters slipping through the cracks because of the client comments not being entered correctly to say who's representing, or?
I would say that this is a grants issue, and it may be that they just don't have the time given their current capacity. So what I've been saying to most people is that when you get those capacity requests, have an LSO do
Because
another
we do.
conflict
Our
check.
LSO double checks everything, just in case.
Because we've had a number of instances where we're representing both parties in child protection proceedings, in DV proceedings, and that ultimately means we have to refer both files out. So.
Because in one situation, the grants officer said, oh, that's okay, one of you can act for the party, but both of the clients have to say, but they said both of the clients have to give consent that one of you can stay on and the other can't. And I'm like, and I'm like, do you not see the facts where he strangled her? Like, as if he's going to be like, oh yeah, you can have your lawyer, that's fine. Like, of course he's going to make it difficult for my client.
Yeah. I think if you're having a situation where grants are telling you you can act when you can't.
Yeah, we just were like, no.
But I have seen situations where grants come back and say, well, no, I checked the policy, you can see me before you allocate it.
You're our default now.
Yeah, pretty much. Either send me an email, give me a call. I do prefer emails because then I can save that document, register. But I will have a look into it and just see if there's something that maybe perhaps your LSOs aren't seeing or something along those lines.
Like the party's surname spelt incorrectly.
Yeah,
By
that
the
happens
court.
a lot.
Because that's what the other parties put on the documents, and that's not their surname at all.
Yeah.
And we miss it.
And if you are facing issues where you are getting a lot of files that come through that are clearly conflict files, can you please just let me know so that I can keep an eye on that situation?
Yeah.
Yeah. Any other questions? No? Great. Well, happy Friday, everybody.